here to present our research that I did at RMIT's Exertion Games Lab with Florian Mueller on how adding interactive display to a public basketball hoop can motivate people and foster a sense of community, which I feel like kind of gives the whole thing away where to start. But we're going to go ahead and start with a little video to kind of give you guys an idea of what we did, and then we'll talk further about our results. No sound currently, but I was kind of sort of see if I can find the video component real quick to see.
For instance, showing the number of total baskets scored in a day when people play longer, trying to hold out for the excitement of hitting that 1,000th basket. Moreover, having information about the activity in the space made non-players feel connected to the players of games, fostering a greater sense of community in the space.
We're hoping that our research will lead other designers to more effectively create public displays for urban spaces.
So, the first question we have is, why are we doing this work? What's our motivation? So this here is Federation Square in Melbourne, Australia, where we're from, and that's not a big painting on the wall, it's a public video display. We're starting to see these large public displays in a lot of places, whether they be public squares like here in Melbourne, or whether they be things like shopping malls and retail stores. So as screens get cheaper, we're going to start seeing more of these. But we're also seeing a lot of things like Fitbit and Jawbone and Nike Plus, and we've noticed this trend for people to be really excited about using technology to enhance their experience when it comes to exertion, when it comes to exercise, when it comes to playing games. So we want to look out in the future. We see these two trends colliding. And so we want to figure out how can we better create experiences that merge these two things before anybody else kind of starts getting into that space, so we can kind of have a head start on making the world a cooler place for people doing exertion in public. So we look at public game spaces, which we define as publicly accessible spaces intended for play. We think this is really important because these spaces provide not only opportunities for anybody to come out and play in the community, but they also offer opportunities for spectatorship and to create a sense of community. Now this contrasts with things like private game spaces. So like this racquetball court here, people who belong to the gym, they can come, they can play, they can have a great time, but it kind of lacks the community aspect because you have to sign up to the gym. And the spectator aspect is also kind of missing. I mean, if you go into your local private gym and just start watching people, it's a little creepy. You're probably going to get kicked out. So we're not talking about these spaces. Public arenas. We have games and a lot of spectatorship, obviously. But we're really missing out on the ability for anybody to go just walk up and play. You can't go play 3-on-3 with LeBron. They're going to kick you out the court. And so we're not really looking at those spaces either. We're really looking at these spaces like public basketball courts, public soccer pitches, baseball diamonds, where the whole community can kind of get involved if they'd like to and play whatever they like. So what did we try? We went ahead and built Half-Court Show. It's a simple intervention. It's the small LED display which is connected to an infrared sensor at the basket, kind of like those arcade basketball games. And it's driven by an Arduino, it's battery powered, and so we can sense whenever a basketball goes to the hoop. During our 10-week experiment, we tried 3 different modes. We had the counter display here for the first 4 weeks, where we reset it to 0 every morning, and throughout the day, anytime somebody shot a basket through the hoop, it would go up by 1. And so people could see how many shots had been successfully made through the course of the whole day. The second intervention we tried was this timer display, where for the next 3 weeks, anytime somebody shot a basket and went through, the timer would reset to 0 and then start counting tenths of a second up, kind of giving people a notion of how long it's been since the last shot. And finally, we tried this text display for the last 3 weeks, where anytime a basketball was shot, a set of exclamation points would kind of flash, and then a set of text would scroll past, giving either kind of motivational trash talk. So we'd be like, hey, what's defense? Or, my mom shoots better than that. So once we had during this 10-week session, we went ahead and interviewed people. Over the 10 weeks, we interviewed a whole total of 164 people, 86 players, 78 inhabitants, who were people who were specifically not players, people who were wandering through space, people who were out there taking a break, smoking, or just sitting back and watching basketball, but weren't actually part of the groups playing. We asked them questions about kind of how did you feel about the hoop, how did it change, how did it affect your play, how did it affect your experience in space. So what did we find out? So first, on the individual side of things, noticeability was kind of this big thing. And how noticeable were people able to ignore it? Were people able to did it distract people? And overall, we found that most people really appreciated kind of that it existed and they could look at it if they wanted to, but it kind of faded into the background. We did have 2 participants who noticed that it kind of distracted them a little bit. We'll get back to that, but that's kind of an important thing. But in terms of findings, that people saw or ignored a display is not necessarily groundbreaking. What we found was interesting, though, on the individual side was motivation. Despite having this just very small, simple display, people actually got motivated to do more exercise or change their exercise patterns in space. For instance, with the counter display here, people would actually go ahead and wait and play longer in order to get to a big number. Interestingly enough, kind of the way people were motivated changed based on content. That, for instance, with the timer display, people got really excited trying to shoot as many baskets as they could quickly to kind of get that number down. And the text display kind of gets into the next topic. It really kind of had this social effect where people would kind of read the display and kind of have a more personal attachment to it that wasn't necessarily directly related to their exertion investment, but definitely improved their experience. Because we had this really cool thing that we totally didn't expect, this kind of idea of fantasy, where people would, even though it's a very simple display, kind of people referenced stadiums and going to sports events, and for them it kind of triggered this sense of officialness and sense of fantasy. Like this one player kind of feeling like I'm in the NBA, feeling like I can imagine a crowd cheering around me. That's just a cool thing. But in addition to the effect that it had on individuals, there's also these social effects that we thought were really interesting. So, for instance, common context was kind of this awesome thing that our display kind of provided for people. So, this kind of came out in 2 ways, where number one, people who were just playing together, they kind of had the display and they kind of served as a focal point for different interactions that they had. So, like when the text display was up, they would kind of, somebody would shoot a basket and they would all read it and they would kind of joke around about it. But interestingly, that also extended between groups. And so you actually had situations where, especially with the text display, people who were just watching the game and kind of they didn't know the players. They'd see players shoot a basket and kind of a joke comes up and be like, hey, where's the defense? And the guy would be like, yes, Kevin, where's the defense? And because they also saw this joke be shown up on the screen, they felt like they were actually part of the experience, where instead of just like, okay, we're isolated socially from them, we had this experience that we had that greater sense of connection to the people. Interestingly as well, this effect kind of had this temporal aspect too, especially with the score counter, where it was this constant information that persisted throughout the day. You had the situation where people in the space were able to actually feel connected to people who were in the space previously in the day who weren't there anymore. And so this kind of developed this social awareness of activity in the space, which people really made them feel like they were more greatly connected. So from these findings, we went ahead and did some analysis and came up with a set of design dimensions. So kind of for people who are looking at creating experiences similar to this, kind of what sort of things should you really spend extra time thinking about and figure out. So, like I mentioned earlier, noticeability was this kind of big thing, where obviously any display, any intervention has the potential to distract people. But if you make something that's really not noticeable, then nobody's going to be able to look at it. So, as a designer, figuring out what's the right point along that spectrum from completely unnoticeable to really in your face That's something that needs a lot of tweaking. It needs really deliberate thought. The second design dimension that we came up with was kind of how do we support different play actions. So as we were talking about in motivation, that things like the score counter really encourage people to play longer, where the timer made people play in a more intense fashion. And so rather than when we kind of started this project, we were just kind of like, okay, how does this affect basketball? But realizing how many aspects of basketball you can influence, or whatever game that you want to affect. Really thinking about that and deciding where you want to focus your display on is a really important aspect. Finally, supporting this kind of social behavior and supporting how to connecting people across different social groups and across time. It's something that I think really needs to be deliberately designed for. That you can make a display that only supports people who are just directly playing basketball and kind of like you say, I don't really need to care about the people walking through the space on the way to work. Or you could have a display where you want to really focus on the spectators in the space, and the players are kind of a secondary concern. But figuring out who to support and how you make a common context for those people is definitely something that needs to be figured out as part of the design process. So, kind of with these design dimensions and based on our personal experience with Half-Court Show, we came up with a number of strategies, kind of news you can use. If you want to build a display, this is what we personally recommend based on our experience. So, number one, design for ignorability. That we think it's really important in these spaces that you let people play in an uninterrupted fashion. And so, primarily people in our space are coming to play basketball. We don't want to disrupt that. We just want to be able to. So, by making a design that allows people to kind of ignore the display if they want to, it really gives them the choice whether or not to kind of mentally turn on and off the display, since they don't have any physical control over it. So that's something we consider very important for our design. Number two, changing the display content when nobody's playing. That with the sensors that you have on the court, we were able to figure out, for us, if nobody was shooting the ball in 300 seconds, we assumed that play had stopped. And so, for instance, in our text display, we actually had started up a kind of professionally written comedic scroll that was kind of some jokes and some things that people in the space were just eating lunch when nobody was playing. They were able to kind of sit down there and watch. And it was really interesting to them because it allowed, so instead of this display being just, oh, that's the basketball hoop and that's the display that's for the basketball players, it becomes this idea of, hey, there's a screen and it's talking to me that I'm interacting with it, and so all of a sudden, instead of this basketball court being a separate thing, it's actually makes people in the space who aren't playing actually feel like, oh, this is a part of my space. I belong here. I think it's really important for creating these contextual connections between groups of people in space. Number three, using context to derive fantasy. There's a sort of design language that's fairly common in sports arenas. So in our instance, we have these red LEDs, which kind of very evocative of these sort of displays that we see in professional arenas. And I think that leveraging that design language in displays that we make for public game spaces is a really, really big win. That it allows people to kind of imagine themselves to be in these professional environments, and really gives them a certain sense of joy that they wouldn't have otherwise had. Number four, motivating play with unusual content. Something that we kind of noticed so our first intervention with the score counter, we were asking people, okay, how was your experience? And something that kind of kept coming up was people like, oh, we want to make a shot clock. And so we built a timer display. And then everybody was like, well, we don't really use a shot clock in our games. And so as a result, we're trying to go more towards a professional experience, yet since that professional experience already has this kind of set of rules and expectations to it, it really limited people's ability to play with it, or their engagement with it. Meanwhile, the text display here, even though it's kind of really, there's no trash talk display if you go to, Key Arena in Seattle, if you go watch the Bulls, you're not going to see, and make fun of the other players, but we saw people, I mean, they loved it. Like, it was definitely the most engaging experience that people had. You know, they would stop play and, you know, read it to each other, you know, make fun of each other. And so we definitely see this kind of trend where by giving some people something surprising, it winds up being more engaging and more flexible for them. So we'd encourage people to working on this sort of displays to go in that direction. Our next strategy is exploiting round numbers. Like, when people were close to 1,000, they got really excited. It was really awesome to see it. I mean, people would shoot that 1,000th basket and they would stop and they would clap. It was really, really cool to see people, you know, respond to this. You know, realistically, there's no difference between 999 and 1,000 and, you know, 1,500 in terms of the actual action of the basket. But this extra information kind of gets people excited, and that's a cool thing. And it can also lead to this kind of goal-setting behavior where people are like, okay, you know, I'm kind of tired, but, you know, we're coming up on 700. Let's make it, guys. So, you know, using that psychology is definitely valuable. Our final recommendation is sharing information across time. So here at night, when we see it was obviously a slow day with only 361 baskets, but through providing information and context about kind of the activity of people's space previously, it really gives people a greater sense of community and connection. I think kind of the best story about this was there's a researcher there in a different, I think he worked in mathematics, and he would be there on the weekends. He'd be super busy, and it was really depressing for him to be like, it's Sunday and I'm here at work. But he would go out, he was a smoker, and so he'd be out there in the morning at like 10 o'clock, and you'd notice, oh, there's, you know, 200 baskets shot. And then he'd go back up, and he'd come back down at, you know, 4 o'clock, and he'd take another break, and, you know, it's up to 800, and even though there's nobody actually playing at either of those times, it's like, wow, obviously, you know, I'm not the only person here. It's, you know, it's a much less lonely experience, and I feel motivated by just the fact that I know that there's activity going on in this space, and I can feel connected to it. So, kind of wrapping things up, our paper, first and foremost, kind of explored this design space. It's kind of it's something people haven't really looked at previously, and we wanted to kind of throw an opening salvo out there and see, you know, make some devices, make some experiences, and see how people react. And through that, we were able to design a preliminary set of design dimensions that we hope will help other designers continue into this field and kind of make better, more informed decisions about their creations. And we feel like we wanted to deliver concrete strategies that can help other people who want to continue this work make their experiences more awesome. Moving into the future, we would love to kind of start doing some work on kind of what specific things can motivate people. You know, obviously we're the Exertion Games Lab, and, you know, our bread and butter is making people, you know, work harder, you know, get more pumped up. And so, you know, what specific things can we do to achieve that? And, you know, what specific design elements can motivate people and improve experiences? So, from the Exertion Games Lab, I want to thank you guys for coming and listening, and if any of you guys are looking to do a PhD, we're looking for candidates. So, thank you.
Timo ja Jussi Oulu, Finland. This was one of the very few papers I've seen here that actually has real people using some Ubicomp system without thinking themselves as test users, or probably not knowing that they were part of an experiment, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
You mostly reported interview observations. So did you actually, or can you recall any kind of covert observations that you conducted outside those interviews? Because I think those observations would be very interesting to hear, I mean, like spontaneous reactions, etc., etc. So that's one question. And then the second question related to that, did you observe any sort of temporal changes? Because typically when you bring provocative installation into somewhere, so there's this immediate reactions, and then as time goes on, it may sort of wear off. So could you comment on those two things?
Sure. So the first question kind of being about, you know, did we do kind of covert observations and kind of and we did not as part of our experiment, unfortunately. the second question was,
Temporal changes, if the
right, so kind of the novelty effect and how over time, and realistically, most of the changes that we saw were fairly subtle. I mean, most of the basketball players in our space were really there to play 3-on-3 basketball. But we did not so each duration was 3 or 4 weeks, and over the course, we saw people kind of get used to it, and if anything, kind of more incorporate it into kind of especially the practice sessions. And we did not experience kind of a decline in novelty, but at the same time, it was only 3 or 4 weeks per intervention, so it's hard to tell, over a 3 or 4 month period, if people would continue to use it or be like, oh, I used it once or twice and now I'm bored with it. So.
Hello? Okay. As a long-time basketball player, I really get excited about this kind of work. But it was just an LCD display for 10 weeks. And I wonder, you described a lot of positive things about it. I wonder, did anyone just not like it or ignore it or not think anything about it?
So a lot of people ignored it. And so one of the kind of interesting things was, especially in the non-players, the players, they were there all the time, and so they at least saw it. Like during 3-on-3 basketball, I mean, they thought it was really valuable that they could just kind of ignore it and keep playing their games. But the spectators, even people who were watching it for 20 minutes, a lot of them didn't even notice the display. Probably I think about 20 people out of the 76 didn't notice the display, which kind of feeds back into that noticeability dimension of, if we made a giant traffic sign, that probably people would see that, but that would be super distracting. And so figuring out that noticeability.
So the other thing I just wanted to ask is, so you mentioned a lot the concept of fostering a community. But again, so kind of reflecting on the previous question, so your study was just 10 weeks. I wonder, fostering a community kind of suggests a more long-time effect, like the community supports each other over a long period of time. I wonder if you think that community would persist after your 10-week observation.
It's an excellent question. I think that, based on our interviews, most of the kind of connection between people seems to be, especially connection between groups of people, seem to be really context-driven. Especially given that RMIT has a lot of different class schedules, different people coming in and out. I would not necessarily expect, once this intervention is gone, people to keep, feeling like they're connected to these people, because they are strangers and with group dynamics. But that's just a guess.
Greg Priest-Norman from Ubicomp. Excuse me. I really love that aspect of what you're doing with respect to the persistence over time, and kind of adding that shift so community can be time-based, the person not feeling alone, even if there's no one. But I'm wondering if you did anything looking at the balance between the first principle and the fourth one, the designing for ignorability, which is something we obviously take very much to heart. And then when you said the whole game stops while they look at that's kind of the opposite of designing for ignorability. So did you look at or did you see anything that would indicate what for this occurrence with that right balance, where it became intrusive if there was too much game stopping, but they were totally ignored if there wasn't some of those kind of events going on? Did you see any of the balance or trade-offs between that first principle and fourth principle?
So I think, for me, I see the noticeability and the real risk there as being active disruption of, when display, for one or two people kind of mentioned that, they kind of got some after images, for instance, kind of distracted their focus, versus kind of this social experience of people stopping to play voluntarily to, talk smack to each other. And it's hard to tell whether that second category of, people saying like, oh yeah, it says, just like LeBron, and be like, yeah, I'm just like LeBron. It's hard to tell if that's disruptive or if that just kind of contributes towards the kind of general smack talking that to some extent already existed pre-intervention, and this kind of just amplified that. So it's a tough question, and I think it's really tied up in just the social dynamics of the players themselves.
But you could look at total amount of time being active or total
Sure.
amount of scores and say, well, when we upped the amount of verbiage on the display, they actually were there for maybe physically longer, but playing for less of that time. I mean,
Sure.
I could see some ways you could have some criteria to say it's really detracting from their overall, athletic activity or it's enhancing it.
No, I think that's a very good point about, and it kind of keys into, what are our goals? Is the goal to, exclusively, primarily, drive greater exertion activity, or, create more sense of community, or create more intense play, and kind of ties into the,
I guess what I'm really saying is at what point does the display become a participant in their interaction versus just simply enabling their interaction?
right, I don't think I have a
Good, cool.
good answer for that, but thank you.
Hi. Nemanja from University of Lugano. I really like your talk. I'm just kind of not sure with some of the findings you have and conclusions, just because did you do any studies prior to introducing the display on what kind of social activities were happening there? Because, for example, I might be just wearing a Miami Heat jersey and thinking, oh my God, I'm a pro now. And then you have a display and you sort of have the same effect.
So, to answer your question briefly, we did not do kind of preliminary studies into ethnography, but kind of the questions that we were asking and the responses that we got tended to be specifically keyed into people's reactions to the display. And so, with the people who kind of expressed this fantasy, I mean, they were all specifically kind of mentioned that it was, feeling of the lights that was keying this. And I think there are certainly other things that can help them achieve that sense of fantasy. If everybody showed up, in uniforms or something, and you have to have official teams.
Because I think it would be also interesting to see first how people actually behave without a display.
Sure.
Because they might also share information regardless of the display. And also, I'm kind of going through the data and trying to figure out why certain dimensions were chosen. Because you say you interviewed 83 people, and then in dimensions you mentioned like 10 out of 83 participants said that, I don't know, 70 didn't. So how did you distill which dimensions are important?
So we did kind of an affinity diagramming or a process where we kind of using our taking this qualitative data and kind of just seeing where these kind of key insights from people kind of naturally grouped into certain areas.
And what are the future plans? I remember you had